Greetings, digital citizen. This time we are reviewing a book by Alfredo Jalife Rahme, In Way to De-globalization. The initial section, Hacia, desglobalización, immediately establishes the book's central thesis. The current model of deregulated neo-feudal or techno-feudal globalization is in decline and has been for some time. The author, Alfredo Jalife Rahme, wastes no time in asserting this, drawing upon a previous work, El lado oscuro de la globalización, posglobalización y balcanización, to underscore the continuity of his critique. Jalife Rahme introduces the concept of desglobalization, deglobalization, not as a theoretical construct, but as an observable phenomenon, citing prominent figures like Stephen Roach of Morgan Stanley. Roach's reluctant admission that globalization has entered a twilight zone of transition and is moving towards localization serves as a key piece of evidence. This transfer of power, particularly in the political sphere, is highlighted as a significant outcome, exemplified by the shift in control within the U.S. Congress. The author meticulously details the economic implications of this shift, noting the reversal of the historical trend where capital returns were at their highest while labor compensation was at their lowest. He predicts a new correlation of forces, including an increase in minimum wage, higher taxes on the oil industry, and greater scrutiny of executive compensation, all indicative of a move away from unchecked financial globalization. A critical point of analysis is the distinction between globalization and localization, with the latter representing a political reorientation towards national interests rather than the exclusive interests of an oligarchical plutocracy. Jalife Rahme argues that the supposed benefits of globalization have failed to materialize, especially in G7+ countries, where the primary beneficiaries have been capital holders, while blue-collar and white-collar workers have suffered. This failure, he contends, has sown the seeds for a political backlash in favor of the working class. The section also delves into the questioning of globalization's validity by influential publications like Foreign Affairs, which, through articles by Rawi Abdelal and Adam Siegel, asks whether globalization has passed its peak. Jalife Rahme critiques the conflation of economic globalization with technological revolution, asserting that financial speculators have distorted the latter for their own gain. He emphasizes that the institutional foundations of globalization are weakening, leading to a mixed prognosis for its future. In essence, this opening segment sets a critical, almost cynical tone, arguing that the era of unchecked financial globalization is ending, giving way to a more localized and regulated world order driven by geopolitical shifts and a reassertion of national interests over corporate ones. The author's presentation is dense with references and economic data, supporting a strong polemical argument against the prevailing neoliberal narrative. This section meticulously dissects the crucial distinction between economic globalization and financial globalization, arguing that the latter, driven by speculative motives, has far outstripped the former in its depth and reach. The author posits that while economic globalization theoretically encompasses financial services, the reality is a grotesque imbalance where speculative financial services have overshadowed their economic matrix. Jalife Rahme highlights the unregulated nature of financial globalization, contrasting it sharply with economic globalization, which operates under the rules of the WTO. He identifies 4 key characteristics of financial globalization. 1. Deregulation, lack of governmental supervision. 2. Offshore operations, use of tax havens to avoid taxes. 3. Invisible accounting, assets and liabilities are not reflected in financial statements, representing private transactions. 4. Exotic speculative bubbles, creation of high-risk financial derivatives like hedge funds, swaps, options, and forwards. The author asserts that financial globalization is primarily controlled by the G7 nations, forming a unique characteristic of the Anglo-Saxon sphere, with Wall Street and the City dominating global financial markets. He cites various financial institutions and their global reach to underscore this point. Jalife Rahme reiterates the incompatibility between economic and financial globalization, suggesting that the planet is undergoing a de-globalization process, not only economically, but also politically. He anticipates the imminent financial deglobalization as the final blow to the waning power of the Anglo-Saxon banking system. The text further introduces the perspectives of central bankers like Ben Shalom Bernanke and Jean-Claude Trichet, who express concerns about the concealment of M3 data and the risks of severe difficulties in the U.S. economy. Emmanuel Wallerstein's work is referenced as correctly bearing the outdated model of globalization. The author also presents the Chinese perspective through Chung Si-wei, who outlines 4 stages of globalization, emphasizing that financial globalization is incompatible with economic globalization. China, while benefiting from economic globalization, views financial globalization with apprehension. The Chinese strategy focuses on knowledge-based growth and the role of technology in production and management, while also advocating for fair conditions for transnational corporations operating within China. Jalife Rahme concludes this section by highlighting the overwhelming dominance of Anglo-Saxon financial power as evidenced by various financial tables. He argues that the petroleum globalization is a distinct phenomenon where state-owned oil companies are gaining prominence over private Anglo-Saxon transnationals. The rise of BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, is presented as a significant shift in global economic power, challenging the traditional dominance of the G7. The section ends by emphasizing that the Anglo-Saxon world's financial dominance is being eroded, and a new multipolar economic order is emerging, driven by the BRIC nations. This segment delves into the critical role of oil in the context of deglobalization, asserting that the energy sector is a primary driver of geopolitical shifts. Jalife Rahme begins by referencing Alan Greenspan's Lugubre Testamento Petrolero, Somber Oil Testament, highlighting the precarious balance of oil supply and demand and significant impact of even minor disruptions on prices. Greenspan's admission of limited options for the U.S. to lower oil prices in the short term underscores the severity of the energy crisis. The author introduces his thesis on the precio financiero, financial price of oil, arguing that speculative financial instruments such as over-the-counter oil futures and derivatives have distorted the market. He contends that virtual inventories of oil in speculative paper far outweigh real inventories, creating a sword of Damocles over OPEC and making the market vulnerable to financial dumping by Anglo-Saxon speculators. This speculative manipulation, coupled with a devalued dollar, allows these speculators to profit from rising oil prices, a situation Jalife Rama deems aberrant. The text criticizes the legendary productivity and flexibility of the U.S. economy, arguing that it came at the expense of labor and was facilitated by deregulation and globalization. Jalife Rama questions the permanence of this deregulated financial globalization, suggesting that central bankers like Greenspan and Roche are now forced to acknowledge the geopolitical dimension of oil. The segment then transitions to Resurrección del Nacionalismo Petrolero en Latinoamérica, según el Pentágono, where the author discusses the resurgence of resource nationalism in Latin America. He highlights the U.S. economic patriotism that blocked foreign acquisitions of energy assets while criticizing similar actions by other nations. The Pentagon's report on the danger of oil nationalism in Latin America is presented as evidence of U.S. concern over state control of energy production. Jalife Rama critiques the neoliberal rhetoric used to justify the privatization of state-owned resources, arguing that it benefits a parasitic oligarchical plutocracy. He cites Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador's actions to nationalize their oil industries as examples of this resurgence. Finally, the segment introduces Las Magnificentes Siete Hermanas Estatales del Petróleo y el Gas, where Jalife Rama discusses the rise of state-owned oil and gas companies. He criticizes the media's role in promoting the artificial bankruptcy of Pemex, Mexico's state oil company, to push for privatization. He highlights how state-owned companies like Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, CNPC, NIOC, PDVSA, and Petrobras now control a significant portion of global oil and gas production and reserves, dwarfing the traditional Anglo-Saxon Seven Sisters. This shift, he argues, is a direct consequence of the geo-energetic globalization and the defeat of Anglo-Saxon unilateralism in Iraq. The segment concludes by emphasizing the new equation of the 21st century, a plummeting dollar and a surge in oil, gas, and gold-silver prices, signaling a profound shift in global power dynamics. 3 scenarios of deglobalization. In this context of undeniable deglobalization, the author proposes 3 distinct scenarios for the future: a soft and reformed globalization, regionalization with mixed economies and greater regulation, and a neo-humanist renaissance or 21st century socialism where human values supersede market forces. First scenario, soft and reformed globalization. Jalife Rama critically examines the perspectives of prominent figures like George Soros and Joseph Stiglitz, who advocate for a reformed, more humane globalization. He dismisses Thomas Friedman's flat world theory as simplistic and critiques Soros's past involvement in neoliberal policies, suggesting his current philanthropic stance is a form of transvestism. The author highlights Soros's deep understanding of financial mechanisms, but questions his reformist zeal, especially given his past actions and the closed nature of his open society initiatives. Stiglitz, despite his Nobel Prize and critiques of globalization's excesses, is portrayed as an intellectual opium for the globalized, offering superficial reforms that fail to address the fundamental cancerous pathology of financial globalization. Jalife Rama asserts that Stiglitz's proposals are too ethereal and do not offer a real solution to the inherent anti-human nature of the market-driven model, which has led to environmental degradation and social disharmony. The author concludes that a soft and reformed globalization merely relaxes the grip of financial tyranny without breaking its hold, ultimately failing to bring about genuine liberation. Second scenario, regionalization with mixed economies and greater regulation. This scenario suggests that the future lies in regionalization, characterized by mixed economies and increased regulation, in stark contrast to Anglo-Saxon deregulation. The author posits that financial globalization is declining, while economic globalization is rising, leading to the formation of regional blocs. He highlights South America as a prime example, where leaders are pursuing financial and economic liberation, inspired by the European Union's model of political and monetary integration. This includes initiatives like Mercosur and the potential for common currency and foreign policy. Jalife Rama contrasts this with the failed NAFTA model, which he describes as a vulgar mercantilist treaty that has exacerbated inequalities and led to massive migration from Mexico. He emphasizes that the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are moving towards regulated, mixed economies, challenging the Anglo-Saxon financial model. The author also discusses the ASEAN bloc in Southeast Asia, which is evolving towards a mercantilist and communal regionalism that includes India, China, Australia, and New Zealand, focusing on justice, economic development, and common security. This regionalization, he argues, is a response to the Darwinism of unchecked globalization, allowing medium and small countries to survive and thrive. Third scenario, neo-humanist renaissance or 21st century socialism. The most radical scenario envisions a future where human beings are at the center of exchanges, replacing the market. Jalife Rama invokes the humanist spirit of Terence, nothing human is alien to me, and critiques financial globalization as an anti-human and boring model that has trivialized ethics and aesthetics. He calls for a return to the biosphere and a recognition of the interconnectedness of all living beings, drawing on Vladimir Vernadsky's concept of environmental conflicts. The author argues that the invisible hand of the market has led to devastation, predation, ecocide, and humanicide. He questions whether the United Kingdom, despite its historical advantages, can offer a model beyond deregulated financial globalization. Jalife Rama suggests that a bioethical approach, bridging technology and humanism, is necessary for salvation. He emphasizes that the neoliberal globalists have exhausted their ideological innovations, and their superstition of the providential market will be relegated to the dustbin of history. The author concludes with a powerful call for a rehumanized planet, where the human being, not the market, is the immutable center of creation, leading to a humanist 21st century. He stresses the importance of citizen power and the democratization of media to achieve genuine mental liberation from the totalitarianism of financial globalization. The author reiterates that the 21st century will be humanist, or it will not be at all. The end. Appendice A. ¿Qué es la globalización? The appendix begins by defining globalization, noting that while the term is widely used, its true meaning and consequences are often misunderstood. The author points out that in Mexico, the term has caused more semantic damage than the third way concept. He argues that democratic globalization is an oxymoron, as globalization inherently leads to an ultra-concentration of wealth in the hands of a plutocratic elite, the G7/G10/11, leaving the vast majority of the planet's inhabitants marginalized. The author asserts that globalization is fundamentally anti-democratic and serves the interests of transnational corporations, primarily those from the G7, under the nuclear umbrella of NATO and the unipolar power of the US. He highlights that over 85% of the top 500 global corporations belong to the G7/G10/11. Jalife Rame distinguishes between globalizers, the G7/G10/11, and the globalized, emerging countries, who have suffered the detrimental effects of financial crises. He traces the origin of the term globalization to U.S. business schools in the 1980s, influenced by Marshall McLuhan's global village metaphor. The author identifies 4 key technological innovations that have driven globalization: informatics, aerospace, nuclear, and bioindustrial technologies, with genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, GNR, further concentrating unipolar power. He references an OECD study that outlines 3 stages of globalization: internationalization, transnationalization, driven by outsourcing and downsizing, and globalization proper, global production and information networks. The author criticizes the neoliberal model's sole criterion of cost efficiency, which prioritizes corporate profits over social and environmental well-being, leading to mass layoffs and environmental degradation and the weakening of nation-states. He argues that the invisible loser of globalization is the environment, whose depredation is not accounted for as an externality, a fundamental flaw in the model. The author concludes that while elements of globalization are not new, its novelty lies in 2 aspects: a geostrategic one, post-Cold War expansion into the Soviet vacuum, control of oil and balkanization, and a financial one. The financial aspect is unique to this new globalization, characterized by a massive amount of speculative junk paper, 50 times the global GDP in 2000, that has allowed for the capture of strategic assets in emerging countries and the proliferation of exotic financial instruments. This financial power, concentrated in New York and London, demonstrates that globalization is a game for a few plutocratic transnationals. However, the author notes that the model is fatigued and facing a new global dilemma, shifting the ideological battle from left versus right to globalizers, transnationals, versus globalized, civil society. B. Confusiones conceptuales, globalización, tecnología, civilización, humanismo, universalidad. This section delves into the conceptual confusion surrounding globalization, technology, civilization, humanism, and universality. The author argues that those who misuse the term globalization often misunderstand its economic, financial, and geopolitical implications, frequently conflating it with technology, and subsequently distorting concepts like civilization, humanism, and universality due to their anti-human designs. Jalife Rame traces the evolution of technology from the Greek *techne*, art and application, to its modern, purely applied form. He highlights that technology precedes science, and that their interaction intensified during the medieval period, culminating in Francis Bacon's experimental sciences aimed at controlling nature for human benefit. The author contrasts the rational engineering of the 18th century Industrial Revolution, which organized labor for large-scale production, with the barbaric financial globalization of today, characterized by mass layoffs to reduce costs and boost stock prices, leading to social unrest. He criticizes the utilitarian ideal of greatest good for the greatest number as being inverted by financial globalization, which benefits the smallest possible number of people, the G7 plutocracy, while excluding 90% of humanity. The author emphasizes that technology and science are inherently neutral. Their positive or negative outcomes depend on their application. He argues that financial globalization kidnaps these prodigious findings for anti-human objectives, citing mass unemployment and the rise of robotics as examples. He questions the lack of solutions from globalization's proponents for the millions of displaced workers. Jalife Rame asserts that financial globalization is antithetical to humanist renaissance, which promotes individual dignity, and that it lacks ethical and aesthetic structures, corrupting the very purpose of experimental sciences and utilitarian philosophy. He warns against the tyranny of technology, as described by Jacques Ellul, where means have overshadowed ends, and humans adapt to technology rather than the other way around. The author concludes by stating that financial globalization, far from being a civilization, is its antithesis, lacking civility and civic principles. He suggests that bioethics, as the science of survival, offers a bridge between technology and humanism. He challenges the notion that financial globalization embodies universality, arguing that true universality involves shared objectives for the common good, guided by a humanist vision and regulated technology to benefit the greatest number of people. The author reiterates that the 21st century must be humanist, or it will not be at all.